Education Series. My name is Jackie Doherty. I'm the Director of Education and Outreach. I'd like to take a moment to recognize and thank the members of our agency sponsorship program. You'll see their logos here. Their generous support makes our education series possible. Next slide, please. Also, some housekeeping information. You should have received the slides about an hour ago. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the ARC's YouTube channel. We will email you the video link in the coming days, as well as the presentation again, if you didn't get it in your inbox this morning. At the end of this presentation, we'll take general questions. So please put any of your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand at that time to speak. Due to time limitations, we will not be able to address specific situations. So please keep your questions general. That would be of interest to the whole body. After the webinar, you'll have an opportunity to give us feedback by completing a short survey. Please take a few minutes to let us know how we can make our presentations better, more relevant, and helpful to you. And I think we could advance to the next slide, please. We're very fortunate today to have experienced, knowledgeable presenters who will explain the Department of Developmental Services home and community-based waivers system from both the agency and the provider perspectives. So I'd like to take a minute and thank and welcome presenters Melissa Alvarez, who is DDS Director of Medicaid Waivers and has worked at the agency for 16 years, as well as COO Kevin Solera, who is at the Charles River Center, one of our oldest chapters of the ARC, and has decades of experience in this world in providing services to people with disabilities. So welcome to you both. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to the presentation. Next.
Thank you, Jackie, for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity for inviting us to come and speak about the waivers. So the slides I'm going to present today will give you a general overview of the 3 home and community-based waivers for adults with intellectual disabilities from the DDS perspective. Next slide, please. And I'll turn it over to Kevin.
And thank you again for this opportunity. Actually, Melissa and I are both excited to share some of our knowledge with you. I'm speaking on behalf of a provider agency. As Jackie mentioned, Charles River Center is one of the long-standing providers in Massachusetts. So I'll explain how the waivers affect and are reflected in our services. And we have a unique situation as being a long-standing provider. We were part of the deinstitutionalization era in the 70s and 80s. So we do have a campus-style environment in addition to traditional services out in the community. So I'll also share the perspective both running community-based services and also campus-style services. Next slide.
Okay, so what is a home and community-based waivers? So waivers are a way for people to live and receive services in the community as opposed to an institution as it was done in the past. And they're called waivers because they let states waive the Medicaid rules that only allowed Medicaid funds to be used for things like a physician, hospital, or institutional care. And currently today, Massachusetts operates 10 home and community-based waivers. But today's focus will be on the DDS waivers for people with intellectual disabilities. Next slide, please. So the 3 waivers for adults with intellectual disability are the Adult Supports Waiver, the Community Living Waiver, and the Intensive Supports Waiver. And across these 3 waivers, we have a total of more than 16,000 participants. Next slide, please. Now, who's eligible for a DDS waiver? So there are 2 components of eligibility. So first are the clinical eligibility requirements, and that is determined by DDS. There are also financial eligibility requirements, which are determined by MassHealth. Next. So this is the clinical eligibility criteria that someone must meet in order to qualify for the waiver. So number one, you have to be diagnosed with an intellectual disability as determined by DDS. So this means you do have to have intellectual disability. So we also serve a component of adults with autism spectrum disorder. So those individuals wouldn't necessarily qualify for this waiver unless they also had an intellectual disability. You also have to be 22 years of age or older. You have to also be assessed to need what we refer to as a facility level of care. Basically, what this means is that without services in your home or your community, an individual would potentially require institutional care. They have that level of support need. When you become eligible for the waiver, you have to agree to receive your services in the community as opposed to an institution. And you also must be assessed by DDS to need at least one waiver service per month. Next. So aside from the clinical eligibility that DDS determines, waiver participants must be financially eligible for Mass Health Standard using special eligibility rules for waiver applicants. Now, this is the part I talked about that's determined by Mass Health. And what you see on this slide here are the 2025 financial eligibility requirements. So it talks about an applicant's income, assets. If you have, there's a spouse, there's countable asset limit on a spouse. So that is out of DDS's purview. That is done through the Mass Health eligibility process. So next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 waivers. So what are the differences between them? The biggest difference is how much money someone's waiver services are going to cost per year. So as you see on this slide, there's first is the adult supports waiver. So generally, this is for people who the annual cost of their waiver services is below $60,000. Next up is the community living waiver. That annual limit bumped up a little higher. So this is for people whose waiver services cost below $100,000. And next, above that is the intensive supports waiver. So this is people who require more intensive supports, and the cost of their waiver service is $100,000 or greater. I also would like to point out the other difference is that certain services are only available in some waivers. So for example, the intensive waiver is the only waiver that has 24/7 residential services. So that means if you an individual lives in a group home or they're in shared living, the intensive waiver is the waiver they're going to need, even regardless of their budget. Next slide, please. So these are all the services found across all 3 waivers. I won't read you the entire list, so you'll have this PowerPoint as a reference. But first, you can see what's listed under the adult supports waiver. Those are all the services available in that waiver. And then next is the community living waiver. So the community living waiver offers all the services in the adult supports waiver, plus the addition of the service of live-in caregiver. Next is the intensive supports waiver. So that has the services found both in the adult supports waiver and the community living waiver, with the addition of the services of shared living, residential habilitation, and transitional assistance services. Next slide, please. And this is where I turn it over to Kevin.
So why do we care about waivers? Well, it's important to know that the reason why we define these waivers for the state is that the waivers allow Massachusetts to be reimbursed by their spending towards the services that are aligned to their waiver eligibility. So for instance, if the state of Massachusetts is purchasing group home services from a provider like Charles River Center, for every dollar they spend on that intensive support, the state of Massachusetts gets 50% federal reimbursement for that spending. So you can imagine the financial and budget impact the waivers have on the state budget plan. So this reimbursement is commonly known as FFP, which is a federal financial participation. So Melissa, as a state worker, her primary goal is to make sure that the state waivers, one, align to the services or the spending practices of the state, but also provide clear alignment with the federal rules as it pertains to this reimbursement. So even though the state it doesn't get directly funded to a provider like us, it's part of the state fiscal plan each and every year. They're anticipating this federal reimbursement. Next slide. So for funding, like for Charles River Center, all of our services are reflected based on the waiver criteria. Even though we contract directly to state divisions like Department of Developmental Services, Mass Health, MCB, and Mass Ability, they get their federal reimbursement based on their spending they provide a provider like us. So even though we don't, as a provider for state of Massachusetts, we don't get federal funding directly given to us, it is reflected in the budget through that reimbursement process. Next slide.
So now I'll talk about what the benefits for the individuals on the waiver are. So you heard a little bit about why they're beneficial for the state. So for the individuals, so number one being most important, the waivers are what allow us to provide services to people who want to live in the community. They want to be supported in the community where they live. They don't want institutionalization. Another benefit of being on the waiver is that waiver participants are allowed to have a higher monthly income and still maintain their Mass Health standard benefits. So for the figures for 2025 are, so for example, if you are enrolled in the waiver, you can have a monthly income limit of up to $2,901 and still maintain eligibility for Mass Health standard. Versus if you are not on the waiver, the most your income could be is $1,735. So that's a considerable difference in income limit. I just want to point out that's separate from assets. Assets is still that $2,000 or less. So aside from the Mass Health, there's also the benefit of being on the waiver is once you're enrolled in the waiver, if you are eligible to receive any services that DDS has assessed you to need, you can also have appeal rights. So if any action is taken that adversely affects you, such as a reduction in service or you're denied services, you have the right to appeal that decision. The waivers also give you choice. So choice of service provider. You can choose from any qualified provider. You can transfer services under certain circumstances. I will point out, not all providers may have availability. Transportation also may affect where you're able to receive services. But next slide, please. So as I said, there are choice. So another choice is your choice of service delivery model. So there are different ways you can have your services delivered to you. So first is for the traditional way. So that's through a provider agency, and that's the most common. Next are the self-directed options. So there's agency with choice, and there's the participant-directed program. Next. So within the waiver, you can use a combination of both traditional and self-directed models to receive your services. And if you are self-directing your services, you do have to still abide by the same waiver rules that those in traditional services have to abide by. So in other words, this is to say, self-directing your services isn't kind of a way to get around the rules that we're required to have within the waiver. And I'll also point out that some waiver services can only be delivered through the traditional model, so they aren't able to be self-directed. And from here, I'll turn it over to Kevin for the next slide.
So for examples of those traditional models, and that's typically what a provider like Charles River would offer through referral from the state, our community state supports, group supportive employment, and those are typically within a day programming setting. remote supports and monitoring, which is the newest addition, and that's providing virtual supports to people to be able to live independently out in the community. Stabilization, that's those intensive supports when people are in crisis. Placement services, which is also known as shared living, and residential habilitation, which is group home living. So every 5 years or so, these definitions are reviewed to make sure that what the state is providing or offering for services are aligning to the waiver. So most recently, that remote supports and monitoring became into fruition. So when the state is looking at redefining their waiver, they have to look at what new services that are coming to fruition. So this, even though this seems like a finite list, there is also room to be able to add services in as long as it's ensuring that it's aligning to the waiver requirements. Next slide. So the biggest thing with waiver requirements is the community setting rule. And in the year 2014, 2 new regulations came out that really changed a lot of the work that we did and the collaborative efforts that we have with the state. And that was the community HCBS final regulation, which that creates rules and requirements of what the setting needs to be. And overall, that what it requires is to ensure that the setting is integrated. So in the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more, but the eligibility of these regulations, both ACPS, which is the home and community-based the home and community-based settings policy, both federal and Massachusetts came out in 2014. So what it reflects is the populations you see on the right. So where we're focused on is the individuals with intellectual disabilities, but there's other sectors of the service populations that Melissa spoke of that are part of the 7 other waiver requirements. But we're just going to be focusing on the first, which is the individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Next slide. So how does this play out in services? So as we look at the settings, we have to ensure that all are integrated and fully accessible to the larger community. So when we are developing new sites, both day locations and residential sites, we have to go through a process called saturation. And what that looks like is they take our potential site address and they look at the local vicinity of that address to see if there's any other traditional services being offered. So right now, the rule is if you draw a 1/4 mile circle over an existing site, whether it be a group home, a day program, or one of those traditional models, if that site address is within that 1/4 mile circle, it will be deemed not suitable for development for waiver eligible services. So when you hear families saying, "Oh, this group home has enough land to maybe create an in-law or a secondary dwelling," we're limited on developing those because of this saturation. Okay, so it's really important to understand. As I spoke of, Charles River Center is part of a campus environment. So if you think about when we were part of the deinstitutional era, we were, I'd like to say the history, Charles River was one of the first in the Metro Boston area to develop the first group home outside of Fernald State School. And it's right here on our campus in Needham. We were able to do that because there was a critical need in the 70s and 80s to transition people out of state institutions. So back then, we did not have these rules of integrated settings. So fortunately, we're grandfathered into a campus-style environment, but moving forward, we're no longer able to create a segregated and somewhat isolated a campus to support people with disabilities. We are now held under more stringent terms on ensuring that even though our individuals live on a campus-style environment, we have to show full community integration through our CMS plan. We have to show that we're providing choice to our individuals. We have to show that we are making profound attempts to increase community integration, to bring the community members not only to our campus, but bring our individuals into the larger community. One of the other requirements that the individual seeking care must explore all other options. So even though a referral comes from the state to our services, it's ultimately that person receiving the services in their service team to decide whether or not this is a correct placement or not. So that is another critical piece in making sure that our services are waiver eligible. We also have to ensure that our rights and privacy and dignity and respect are all upheld to our individuals, and there's no coercion or restraint. So a lot of, you think about in 2014, a lot of our rules change on our restrictive practices, our ability to restrain someone. So level 2 plans, which had restraints embedded into the implementation strategies for providers like us, were eliminated. We also have to optimize autonomy and independence of individuals. So there should be a rehabilitation focus on making sure that we are progressing someone's skill and ensuring that people are providing choices of service of daily activities and also the provider. So how this played out in the provider world was we now had to create lease agreements with our individuals to make sure that we're respecting their rights as a resident in our group homes. We also were required to have lockable entrances, providing keys and access to each resident in our group homes, in addition to putting locks on bedroom doors. Now, there are always flexibilities depending on someone's medical complexities or their challenges. So we are able to work around that, but all of our services must start with this level of privacy. And sometimes our parents coming into our services don't understand why we are putting locks on bedroom doors. This is the reason why. It's to making sure our services are aligned to that waiver. We need to make sure if someone needs physical accessibility, that our services, both day services and residential, are fully accessible to our individuals. We also have to make sure our individuals, through house meetings or day programming meetings, that they have a voice and a say of the activities being offered in those settings. We also have to ensure that there's no restrictions on access to food, that they have the freedom to furnish their unit upon their choice and their desires, and they have the freedom to choose their roommates and host visitors at their particular location. Next slide. So as I talked about our campus, obviously we have rules that we need to abide by, especially the campus style that we have. Charles River, that's a very small portion. We also, 90% of our services are that traditional community-based programming. So we have 33 residential homes, 3 of which are on our campus. So how are we moving forward? We are very concerned as the waiver eligibility changes. At one point, our campus style environment may be vulnerable. So right now we're embarking on a very large housing development plan. This is a little rendering. We were able to acquire an additional 3.5 acres of land on our property here in Needham. What that will allow us to do is to develop an 86-unit apartment complex right here on the hill to be another addition to our services. The 86 units of apartments, half of which will be earmarked for people with disabilities, the other half will be earmarked for the normal population that are low income, qualifying for those services. So right now, this is the #1 integrated housing development plan in Massachusetts, providing half of opportunity for people to be supported to live independently in the community, and the other half of the normal population. So for us, as we look at the CMS rule, this is really positioning us to be really a lot more integrated than we are right now. some of the services to allow people to live independently in a large complex like this is to look at and explore remote support monitoring, which is currently part of the waiver eligibility services. But you can just imagine the assistive technology and the development of AI and how that's going to have a reflection on our services moving forward. So right now, we're really investigating what are those virtual supports that are available right now, or what will be available in 3 years when we develop this property, and how are we going to use assistive technology. So providers like us will be partnering with DDS to ensure that as we evolve in our services and embracing technology, that this will be part of the waiver eligibility services as we move forward in the future. Next slide.
Okay, so now you're probably wondering, how do I apply for the waiver? How do I become eligible? So now I'll talk a little bit about that process. So the best thing to do is to speak to your service coordinator about applying. They can absolutely help with that. We do have the language translated, we do have the waiver translated into multiple languages. So after you talk to your service coordinator, they can provide you with an application. You fill out the application, you mail that in. So after that happens, the DDS waiver management unit, that's what I oversee. So we'll review that application to determine eligibility. And you may need to complete additional Mass Health paperwork to show that financial eligibility requirement. If that's the case, someone will reach out to you and let you know what needs to be done. And once we do assess you for eligibility, you're not going to be enrolled into the waiver until you begin DDS services. Next slide. So this is our waiver application. It's just one page. There's a link at the top where you can find this online. It's also you can also talk to your service coordinator and they can give you one. Next. When applying for the waiver, I always recommend selecting option 1 on the application, which is what you see in that box below. And what this says is, it says, I'd like to apply for all 3 waivers. Now, this gives DDS the ability to assess your eligibility for different waivers, especially as your services or budget changes over time. So this is the most flexible option, and this helps you remain eligible for the waiver, because if option 1 is not selected on the application and you only say, I only want to apply for the community living waiver, you could potentially become ineligible for the waiver down the road if your service needs change, if your budget change. But if we have option 1, we keep your application on file, we can move you to whichever waiver is most appropriate for your needs. Next slide. So when a waiver decision is made, DDS will notify you by mail. In the notice, if you're eligible, it'll tell you which waiver you've been enrolled in. If you're ineligible, it'll tell you the reason why. And all notices will include instructions on how to appeal if you disagree with the decision, whether that's you disagree with what waiver you've been placed in, or you disagree about being found ineligible, you can appeal. And on that form that tells you how to appeal, there is an email, and that email does go to me. So even if you just have a question, you can send it to that appeal email address, and I can answer your questions. And as I just mentioned, once you apply for the waiver, we hold that application on file. Next slide. And I think that brings us to the end of the presentation.
I think we can stop sharing. We just wanted to, we included some links at that last slide. Everyone, if you haven't already received the PowerPoint presentation, will get a copy of it probably in a few days with a link to the recording, because the presentation was also recorded. So let's start looking through some of the questions that are up on the chat. And if somebody wants to speak their question, you can just use the react button below to raise your hand. And I know Diane will be my second set of eyes we want to make sure we get through as many of the questions as we can. Can you explain what the live-in caregiver component is exactly?
Sure. So the live-in caregiver is a service found in the community living and intensive waiver. So what live-in caregiver is, it is the payment for the additional costs of rent and food that can be reasonably attributed to a live-in personal caregiver who lives in the same household as a waiver participant. So this is, it's for somebody who lives in an participant's home. It's not for a participant who lives in a caregiver's home. It's the live-in caregiver also can't be related by blood or marriage to any degree. So it's really just the costs for food and rent that can be attributed to a caregiver. It's not for the caregiving itself. It's a self-directed service, and it's actually not that commonly used, if I'm being honest.
And can you explain how DDS determines which individual goes into which waiver and how those waivers are capped?
So what we do is we look at what DDS services an individual is currently receiving. We see what's the budget of those services. So as I mentioned, each waiver has a budget limit. So let's say an individual is living at home and they just get community-based day supports and transportation. Likely their budget is going to be under $60,000. So we would put them in the adult supports waiver. If down the road they needed to move into a group home, they would need to be reassessed for their waiver and potentially move to the intensive waiver, because the intensive waiver is the only waiver that offers 24/7 residential services. So mainly we look at, number one, what's the budget, and number two, what's their service need.
So who's enrolling my disabled young adult in a waiver? His DDS coordinator? How can I, as the guardian, see what waiver he receives and how much the allocation is?
So we at the DDS Waiver Management Unit will enroll someone in a waiver. The service coordinator is involved with the application process. So they'll be the one to provide you with an application. You could send the application back to them. It can also come back directly to the Waiver Management Unit, but I encourage you to send it back to your service coordinator so they're looped in on the process. So if you're found eligible, the waiver unit will enroll you. And if you have any questions about, is my son or daughter on the waiver? What are their waiver services? What's their allocation? A service coordinator can tell you that.
Can a person be eligible for a waiver and still live at home?
The answer to that is yes. And actually for the adult supports waiver and the community living waiver, those waivers are for individuals who either live at home with family or live independently. So the intensive supports waiver is the only waiver where there'll be individuals who do not live at home and live in 24/7 residential services.
There is renewed interest in campus settings for young people transitioning, but this seems to run counter to the regulations. How can families in DDS work to change the regulation, which initially had good intentions, but now limits choice for individuals and their families? I don't know if Kevin, if that's one you
Yeah,
want
I'll take that one. So yeah, like as I explained prior to that 2014 rule, there was a little bit more flexibility of that. Right now, there are ways to get around some of these rules, but there has to be true justification. So if you're in an area where there's limited options of residential support, that may be a criteria. If there's no saturation issues and there's no other site within, just say 2 miles of the site, they may be able to do a duplex style. But unfortunately, a larger campus style environment typically is frowned upon just because of the federal challenges.
Yeah. And I will point out that is a federal regulation and not a state regulation. So, even if DDS wanted to change that, we don't have that ability because it is federal.
My young adult receives DDS services now. Who's paying for that if not the waivers?
So we do have individuals who receive these type of waiver services but aren't on the waiver. So when that happens, that cost is paid for entirely by the state of Massachusetts, and we do not receive the 50% federal reimbursement on those services. So the 3 DDS waivers are very unique in that regard, because at this time, DDS provides services based on assessed need. You will see that waivers in other states and even other waivers within Massachusetts, you only get services if you do have waiver eligibility. So that's a little bit different way of operating the DDS waiver. So those are paid for by the state, those services.
And Melissa, please correct me if I'm wrong. There's a cap of reimbursement of the waiver. Also, am I correct by saying that? So the federal government limits how much can be applied to each waiver?
Well, we do have a cap on the number of individuals that can be served in the waivers. The good thing is, at the moment, we have ample space. And if we do ever run up to that cap, we do have the ability to go and ask Medicaid if we can increase that limit. So there is a cap on the number that can be served, but we're not at this time close to going over that.
Awesome. So that means on a guardian or a family level that even if someone falls off the waiver or Massachusetts hits that cap, they're not going to be in a vulnerable position. In other states, that may be the case, but in Massachusetts, they'll still provide the service whether it be under the waiver or not.
Is agency with choice an adult support waiver?
So agency with choice is the type of is a way you can get your services, and that service delivery model is available in the adult supports waiver as well as the other waivers I mentioned.
My best friend lives in Pennsylvania and has a severely disabled 30-year-old. They only use these waivers, and that family must prove every year that the 30-year-old needs supports. Will we have to do this in Mass? Caregivers need less work, not more.
So in Massachusetts, how it's set up, as I kind of just touched upon that, DDS does provide services to individuals not on the waiver. We actually do have an internal process where we do have to prove that individuals do need this waiver level of care every year. It's done at the time of the ISP. There's an assessment that the service coordinator fills out that kind of looks at their ability. And I think I mentioned the term earlier, they have to meet the facility level of care. So we have an internal assessment that we do every year, and we have to keep that on record, showing that individuals continue to need this level of support. So there's nothing on the caregiver end that needs to be done to show this that's done within DDS.
And it's also
right, so the others, oh, sorry, go ahead,
Jackie. So I was just saying that, and it's also interesting to know the role of the service coordinator is really critical in making sure that the ISP is written to waiver standards and the services through the plan of care are articulated correctly to the state, so they are getting that federal reimbursement. So the service coordinator acts as the unbiased party to steer those services for the individuals, which is also a requirement, but one of their major roles is to make sure the way they write up the ISP is aligning to waiver eligibility.
And I was just going to add that it could also work the other way, that you go for your annual ISP review and your needs have changed. They've gotten more intensive. And so maybe the adult support waiver is no longer acceptable. You need the community living one. Would you say that's true, Melissa?
Yes.
So it's a review of the needs. Can we continue the services we have now without applying for these waivers?
So at this time, there's no plans to change DDS's model where we provide services for people both on the waiver and not on the waiver. I do, however, strongly encourage everyone to apply for the waiver, see if you're eligible, because there is that added level of protection. There are those benefits that I did mention.
And I think we kind of addressed this question, but I'm going to read it anyway. How frequently is one's eligibility for the intensive waiver reviewed? Is there a possibility with the current proposed Medicaid cuts, the one big beautiful bill at the federal level, that you will have to reapply for waivers every 6 months?
So there's no need to reapply for the waiver. That won't be the case. And there, at this time, there's a lot of talk in the news about these cuts. What do they mean? At this time, it's business as usual for DDS. We have no more indication than what you all see in the news. We don't have any insider information on that. We're continuing business as usual in that regard. And once you're on the waiver, you're going to maintain on the waiver unless something about your services change, say you don't need a service anymore, or let's say your financial eligibility changes with Mass Health, where something happens where you may not need to meet financial eligibility. That could possibly trigger you coming off the waiver or changing to a different waiver. But the proposed Medicaid cuts wouldn't have an effect on like the reapplication process.
Yeah, but what it would have an effect on, so, fast forward, there's cuts to Medicaid. So that the 50% reimbursement that the state currently receives will be lessened. So that means it will have effect on our operating budget. And then for services like us, when this has happened before in the past, either we are limited or reduced our capacity. So we sometimes are unable to accept new referrals, or we actually get a 9C cut, which is a budget cut, and our services our reimbursement is lessened based on the change in reimbursement. So, that's where there's a confusion. Even though providers don't get federal reimbursement, there is a direct correlation with the federal reimbursement that the state receives.
Of the budget, the state budget, trying to pick up more of those costs if they're not getting from the federal. How does DDS monitor that all the requirements of the intensive waiver, such as choice, community integration, and other requirements on the list are actually happening?
So that's kind of the whole DDS system in a nutshell. It's a joint effort between the waiver unit, there's operations, your service coordinators, you have your Office of Quality Management. All of those components of DDS have a hand in making sure we meet all the requirements of the waiver.
Yeah, and it's specifically on a provider. One, to qualify to be eligible to provide services, we have to show and prove that we're doing that. And then when we go through OQE, which is Office of Quality Enhancement, when they come out and do our licensing and certification reviews, there's licensing areas specific to this. So like locked bedroom doors is one of the licensing areas. Providing choice and providing autonomy and independence is all part of licensing and certification standards. So a provider is held to those standards and would be scored downward if they're not providing that.
There are a number of medically complex young adults in Massachusetts that qualify for private duty nursing through Mass Health, CCM. Is that factored into waiver choice? And if so, how?
So within the waivers, we don't have nursing as a service, but you can combine waiver services with Mass Health services. So individuals may have Mass Health nursing and also receive DDS waiver services. Another example of a Mass Health service is day habilitation. So those can be combined with waiver services.
So we've had a request to go back to the slide with the types of waivers, I think, just to kind of, if there were additional questions about that. Are we up for doing that, or do you want to see if we have time after we get through the rest of the questions? We have.
I think we should go through the questions. That person who had asked, I believe, I did post a link that leads to the booklet that has all of the descriptions of each waiver.
All right. So we've got like 6 more questions at least. So why don't we, if we have time, we can go back to that slide. I know there's a lot of information on that slide. That was the one that talked about the 3 different types of waivers and the differences on them. So a person living in their family home can be on an intensive care waiver. Oh, that's not a question. Sorry. Can you apply for the waiver when your loved one is 21 years old with the anticipation of services starting at 22?
Yes, absolutely. And we encourage it even to apply early. So that gives us time to, get the eligibility requirements in order and get someone on the waiver right on their 22nd birthday.
Barbara has a comment. Though an individual can require 24/7 care supports due to medically complex, that does not necessarily mean they're enrolled in intensive supports waivers. Would you say that's true, Melissa?
Let me just read that again. That's correct, because if their budget is under that 100,000 threshold, they may be appropriate for say the community living waiver, for example. Because the annual budget is like one of the main factors that we use to determine what waiver is best for somebody's needs.
What do waiver support brokers do?
So support brokers are more for assist with the self-directed models of service. So they support individuals in self-direction. And you could do a whole different presentation on self-direction itself. So I'll leave that to self-direction experts.
Would it be possible to create a waiver that combines nursing with DDS services into one waiver for the medically complex population?
It would be difficult. I won't say impossible, because you never know, but I would say very difficult, because one of the things that the Centers for Medicaid looks at is they don't want to see us duplicating other services. They don't want us to duplicate what Mass Health does. Mass Health can't duplicate what we do. So because Mass Health offers nursing, it would be difficult to put medical types of services in the waiver. But I will say, as Kevin mentioned, we do renew the waivers every 5 years, and we're always kind of thinking forward, or thinking of ways we could better support people and needs as the DDS population changes.
I'm not seeing any other questions. I think we could share the screen, Diane, and go to the slide number 11, which talks about the 3 different types of DDS waivers for adults with ID, just to see if we had additional clarification needed.
Melissa, when they pulling up the slide, when I saw that, when I think of eligibility and prioritization, is there any, when you think of P1, that would be if someone is, identified as a priority 1, they likely would be intensive supports because they would be qualifying for 24/7 care. Is that safe to say?
Yes, because they would need that waiver if they were going to be in residential services.
So then you typically would see a P2 or P3 in those other lesser waiver programs.
Right, if they were not currently, because services come first and then we decide your waiver. So in theory, those P2s, for example, wouldn't be in a 24/7 residential services. So it's likely they would be more appropriate for the adult supports, the community living. But when they did move into intensive supports, then we can reassess them and move them to that waiver if you select that option 1 on the application.
I think it was slide 11.
Okay.
The next one up.
Let me just go. Oh. Let's go. This one?
Nope, we're not seeing slide 11. We're seeing the first slide, the sponsor logo. You were at 12, so it just was one more before that.
This one?
The one
right before it. That's it. All right, so this one is where you talked about the different types of waivers and what they offer. And you said the biggest difference was the cost of the services, right?
Correct.
So I don't know if Krista, did you have a specific question about this slide?
Nope.
No, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing a question.
Well, I want to take advantage of having these slides up and ask a question about the application. is this application, the way that it's written, is that required by the, is it required under the regulations, or is this an application that was developed by the Department of Developmental Services?
This is our application. It pre-exists me, so I can't say when it was designed, what was taken into consideration, but this is just specifically for the 3 DDS waivers.
Okay, and I think it's existed for a long time. So my question is, you know, on number 1, you know, what is the sense of having 2, 3, and 4 if you have 1? So that's just
that's just because people do have the choice. You can say, I don't want any other waiver but the intensive waiver. So we do give them that choice.
Okay, so if someone applies for, say, the community living waiver, and then they receive a letter and it states they were approved for the adult supports waiver, the DDS does not explain why they were not approved for the other. And I thought that in your presentation that you said that that DDS does explain it.
So we'll say why you're disqualified for a waiver. We'll explain that. If you're found eligible, we'll just say what waiver you're found eligible for. And if there are any other questions, service coordinators are knowledgeable about the waiver, and they could probably answer any questions you may have about why was I picked for this waiver and not another one.
Okay. And then just to clarify, Melissa, the intensive support, the intensive supports waiver, I think I believe that there is this understanding that the person has to live in a group home. But if someone requires 24-hour supervision and they live in their family home, they qualify for the intensive supports waiver, correct?
Well, it depends on their budget. So if they're living in their family home and the family does provide 24-hour supervision, but they haven't been assessed by DDS to need residential services, they would, and their total services cost under $100,000, they would be assessed for a different waiver.
Okay, thank you.
We did get a few more questions coming in too. Karen has confusion about the area of prioritizing. Looking for clarification. It is like P1, priority 1 is given only for emergency placement. Is that true? It's not given because of 24/7 need or medical complexity or budget, but that is an emergency. Is that true about priority 1?
So I can't really speak too much to the prioritization process. So that's managed by DDS operations. And because it's a kind of a larger process outside the waiver, I don't want to give wrong information on that.
Okay.
Right. On a provider perspective, basically they use the ICAP tool. And if someone needs 24/7 care, which ultimately would equal to group home living, they typically will become priority 1, but it doesn't necessarily need to be an emergency situation. So a lot of times when someone's living with a family and the family is able to support them, they likely would not be a P1 because the family is able to support them. They're not in crisis and they have their natural wraparound supports to effectively keep them safe. So, you know, that's where parents sometimes have to communicate proactively to their service coordinator if there's a change in status or the family is unable to take care of their loved one as they used to, or are feeling like it's going to happen in the near future. So I always encourage families, if there's a change in status in a household, especially if you're a P2, there's an ability to be reassessed based on the change in need.
Right. And I think a lot of our older caregivers are facing that. They just can't, provide the same level of supports that they did in the past. Does the cost of the intensive supports waiver of over $100,000 include both the residential cost and the day program costs combined?
Yes, it's the total combined cost of all waiver services. So that could be day, residential, transportation is another one.
So David mentions that it's confusing about private duty nursing coverage in Mass is that federally, the state is required to provide PDN services to individuals under 21 through Mass Health. What happens to those 22 and older? How do they still qualify for PDN if they're beyond the age cap? If DDS waivers don't include this service, who does?
I am unfortunately not.
I could answer
familiar-
that
Okay.
if you'd like. Sorry. So through Mass Health, there is community case management. So if your child would qualify for nursing services, you call community case management, and they would do an evaluation. So it's required that that an individual needs at least 2 hours of skilled nursing care a day in order to qualify. But people definitely over the age of 18 can and do qualify for nursing. But that would be the contact to call, would be community case management through Mass Health.
Thank you, Beth.
That's helpful. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. So if you apply and receive some money from a waiver, do you lose your money or services that the state pays for via DDS? You can only receive one waiver, correct? So is it supplanting other services, or how does that work?
So yes, you can only be enrolled in one waiver. DDS still does pay for these services, but the difference is the federal reimbursement. So DDS pays 100% upfront for the waiver services, and then the state is reimbursed by the federal government. And let me just read the question again. So it's not like you're losing DDS. It's not like DDS is off the hook for the bill if you're on the waiver. We're still paying. It's just the question of will the state of Massachusetts be reimbursed of what a portion of what DDS spent or not.
Got it. So I see it, I want to honor and be respectful of everybody's time. So in closing, I just want to thank our presenters once again, and I want to thank all of you for spending some time with us today, and remind you to please reply, give us some feedback. We can take it if it's constructive criticism. We want to do a better job going forward. And also to remind you that our next webinar, we're taking July off because of the heat. No. We're not going to be doing a webinar till August is our next one, and that one will be on creating circles of support, and that's on August 27 at noon. Again, thank you all. Thank you, Melissa and Kevin. Thank you, Diane, and stay cool out there.
Great.
Thank
Thank
you,
you,
everyone.
everyone.
Bye.